Welcome to the American Reformer Podcast, hosted by Josh Abatoy and Timon Klein. Our mission is to promote a vigorous Christian approach to the cultural challenges of our day, rooted in the rich tradition of Protestant social and political thought.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to the American Reformer Podcast. Usual host here, Timon Klein, editor-in-chief. And I have with me a guest in the studio, per usual. And this time, Pavlos, I don't think you're a repeat guest here, but I've talked to you before, maybe on a different podcast, is what I'm thinking of. But we have Pavlos Papadopoulos, and he is a professor at Wyoming Catholic College. I can let you introduce yourself a little more thoroughly in terms of your interests and what you kind of work on and teach out there, Pavlos. So please go ahead and do that, and then we'll get into our topic for the day.
Sure. Thank you, Timon, for having me on. As you said, I'm a professor at Wyoming Catholic College, which is a Catholic college in Wyoming. We take all three of those parts, Wyoming Catholic and College, quite seriously. We include a substantial outdoor component to our education. So in the Rocky Mountains, where we are in our location, we're Catholic. We have 8 semesters of theology throughout our curriculum. That's all integrated with the rest of the curriculum, but we take the teachings of the magisterium quite seriously. And I myself am Catholic, and we're a college in the older school sense. Despite our Catholicity, the older school sense of college would be more familiar to our founders, to the American founders, than many research universities, because we put a heavy emphasis on studying the classics, Greek and Latin classics, in humanistic disciplines, in philosophy, in political thought, and history, and rhetoric. And so my background is the history of political philosophy. I had a great books curriculum background through my college and graduate school years. I sort of delved into the Straussian political theory world for a while there, and came out the other side a Catholic. And so I have that as my background, but I get to teach quite broadly at Wyoming Catholic College. I get to teach literature and poetry, as well as philosophy and political thought.
Yeah, and you were describing like one of your courses coming up, which sort of which is a unique, I would assume, blend of literature and political works, which seems like a great way to do it. Do you know of any, like, I guess you should call them competitors, other colleges that have structure their curriculum the way you guys do, with that much theology, but also the great books emphasis, and sort of blending those two in that way?
Yeah. On the great book side, certainly my undergraduate alma mater, St. John's College, which despite the name is not religious. It's in Annapolis, Maryland. And it pioneered it was part of the pioneering wave of great books colleges. In its case, in the 1930s, it overhauled its very mundane liberal arts curriculum and instituted an experiment, which is still in place, in reading the great books of different disciplines all 4 years without any electives, without any specialization. And that is a distant predecessor program to our own here. That said, there are others. A notable one being Thomas Aquinas College, with campuses in California and Massachusetts. They basically took the St. John's Great Books approach, said, we love this, but we also want to teach the truth as we see it, which is the Catholic Church's teaching. And so they tweaked it in certain important ways, and added a more expressly theological component. And something, just if your audience doesn't know, something that Catholics have been good at doing the last few decades is coming up with lists of really faithful and classical Catholic schools. So there's an organization called the Newman Guide, obviously named after John Henry Newman, which puts together a guide of high schools and also colleges that are faithfully Catholic and also specifically classical. It's the kind of thing that I look at, that I believe there is a Protestant organization starting to do something similar to that. But that's a pretty well-established venue at this point for getting like-minded Catholic classical educators together at these different levels. And so we do have certain peers, certain overlap in that we believe in the liberal arts and the great books, and in our case, Catholicism. And then one of the things that sets us apart is we do put this emphasis on what Plato calls gymnastic education. The outdoors, we have a program in horsemanship. We like Xenophon as well as Plato. If you think about the different students of Socrates, we like to address the spirited part of the soul as well as the intellect.
Yeah, Xenophon. What in the estate management, or various titles? What's he do every day? Like rides or something? It's part of his routine. When he's asked how is he such a good businessman, he's like, well, I spend the first 3 hours riding my horse. It's like intricate to the process.
Get ready for the day. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. I would have to, I'm duty bound at this point to plug, my colleague, Jesse Rhines' work at Center for Academic Faithfulness and Flourishing, where he's put together a college guide, kind of what you were talking about for,
okay. Yeah.
I can't remember what all at this point, all the sort of criteria are for being included, but it's hundreds of Christian colleges. And he, somewhat different than the Newman Guide in that it's, maybe the Newman Guide's probably willing to make a little bit more judgment in its suggestion for people, which is useful. I think Jesse has tried to create a scoring system that parents can then assess, what are all the elements. And it's great. But there's nothing else kind of like it, at least for Protestants. At this point, so he's kind of in uncharted territory, and it's a great product. But I don't know of any, and some maybe a listener can correct us in comments or in emails. I don't know of a Protestant college that has the same kind of model that you're describing in Wyoming or Thomas Aquinas or any of those. I think it's a great model, especially with the outdoor component. I think that's great. That Wyoming does. In any case, all right, we've plugged your employer. We're safe there. We wanted to talk about today. We're into, probably by the time this comes out, people will already begin to be seeing a lot of preparation for, if they haven't already, the 250th anniversary that's coming up of our great nation next year. I imagine most of this coming fall and winter is going to be taken up with discussions in this way. So we wanted to jump the gun a little bit and talk about it ourselves. It's always, you don't need an excuse to talk about this, but it's a good occasion. So I think, where we should start is of course, do children have to memorize the Declaration anymore? I don't know. I don't think so.
My students at Wyoming Catholic, they memorize at least the opening, the first, I forget if it's 6 or 7 sentences. They're long sentences.
Yeah.
I stopped before the grievances, slightly before the grievances, but we actually do a lot of poetry recitation and memorization as part of our curriculum, which is also great. I mean, it's great for children, but we do that also at the college level. And I always add the beginning of the Declaration and also the Gettysburg Address to this American course that I'm going to be teaching this fall.
Yeah,
but I did not memorize it growing up. I didn't have any
either.
Of this stuff as background. I
think
it was
remember
common.
Being forced to. Yeah. I think it used to be common. I went to public schools and they weren't particularly good ones. And I always joke that I'm going to make my children only memorize the grievances, but have no idea what it's connected to just for some. But I think, I think that's great too. That's something in primary school and colleges that's memory work essentially, and also memorizing things of national and historic significance. I think Richard Baxter says until you're 18, all your education should just be working your memory, because you don't know how to exercise judgment anyway. So he's no philosophy until after you're 18, because it's just dangerous for you. All you should do is just work on making your memory work well. And then, when you're an adult, we'll start talking to you about how to make judgment about things.
Just to that point, I mean, I think there's is a helpful English idiom for understanding why this is so important, which is we say that you know something by heart.
Yeah.
Right? If you've memorized it, you know it by heart. That's a statement of how intimate that thing has become to you. If you have it in your heart, you know that thing by heart. And so what do you know by heart? What does your audience know by heart? I'm sure they know certain prayers by heart. Once upon a time, we knew phone numbers by heart. Maybe it's okay that we don't that doesn't seem as important, something to outsource to just our phones. But gosh, if you're not putting something in your memory in that permanent way, then you've got a kind of vacuum in the middle of your person.
Yeah.
And so prayers, beautiful poems, and of course, great works of oratory in your own language, from literature or from history, especially from the founding. Those seem like the things that we ought to be holding in our hearts. And if they're there, and we're knowing them by heart, they're going to be they're going to be accessible to us whenever we want to dredge them up, recite them so that we can talk about them. But they're also going to be informing you in probably subconscious ways as well.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me it's the prerequisite for good oratory. And we always, like many people, it's easy to lament this, how we've lost that, not just the skill, but sort of the respect or value of good oration in public. Whereas even in the 18th century, that was still considered, in many ways, the highest form of sort of medium and communication. That's why sermons were still, well attended and respected. It's like secondary to have them printed. It's really to be there. John Adams talks about like listening to James Otis for 4 hours, like with no notes, and he's just going. It's because they have all this stuff just internalized, and even if you're not reciting it, verbatim, everyone kind of knows the references. So you have a common language as well, and a means of expression where you don't. There's much more implicit communication in a way that still has reference points of authority, and you don't have to spell everything out and like reinvent the wheel all the time. And that's kind of one thing we want to touch on today. Is there's the Declaration of Independence, rightly celebrated, of course. We don't have to get into what kind of legal authority it should have, but it's stuck around for a reason, and it's going to be celebrated again for a reason. But there's much that's implicit in the Declaration, not only as its occasion and to make it possible, but in the meaning of the words and the ideas themselves that are there. And much of that has been totally extracted from it, and these are now sort of free-floating ideals that can float with the wind to Afghanistan if they want to, or they can float to different peoples and equally apply and all detached from the history and also what was assumed by the authors of the Declaration, the committees, and but primarily Jefferson, we assume. He wanted us to at least assume that. So it's one of the three things on his gravestone. So let's talk a bit about that. I mean, just kick us off with beginning our discussion with what undergirds what's being talked about and expressed in the Declaration. What's assumed, and what would, if you were an 18th century colonist, would be American? What is already in your mind and brain that's assumed there when you see the sort of high-flying language on the page?
Sure. I want to begin just with some of the text of the Declaration itself. We often neglect the opening sentence, and looking carefully at the first two sentences of the Declaration actually, I think, is illuminating. Right. In the first, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that have connected them to another, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Something to note immediately from that statement. There's several things in there. First is that the kind of agent we're concerned with is peoples, not individuals. We're going to get to individual rights, and that's what often catches our attention from the Declaration of Independence. But that's actually in the next sentence. And the Declaration, the entire Declaration, is framed first by the fact that there are peoples in the world, and then this document is a statement on behalf of a certain people. And secondly, that opening sentence asserts that the laws of nature and nature's God entitle peoples to equal stations, right? Entitle peoples to sovereign status side by side with one another. And so there's a claim that there is a kind of theological and natural, which ultimately comes back to theological, warrant for the existence of distinct nations. It uses the term peoples. I think it's fair to say nations is a roughly equivalent term there. And then the third thing to note is that it promises to declare the causes, right? We are going to declare the causes. And the funny thing is that what what comes immediately after that in the second sentence is the "we hold these truths" sentence.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the grievances, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you think about what are the causes of the American Revolution, our natural answer to that is like, well, the king was acting in an oppressive manner, right?
Mm-hmm.
More precisely, actually, Parliament was abusing the American
Yes.
people. The king was irresponsibly going along with it, then cooperating, etc. There's a conflict between the British and the Americans. Uh, the Declaration goes to a much deeper level first, and it says the way I read the connection between the first and second sentences is that let's declare the causes. The first and most fundamental cause is that we hold these truths to be self-evident. We're a certain kind of people, and implicitly, there are other kinds of people who do not hold these truths to be self-evident.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the way we normally read that second sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. But I guess what I'm doing is I'm putting the emphasis where I think it should be on we hold.
Mm-hmm.
The truths are self-evident. And in fact, it's undeniable that these truths were not always held to be self-evident. It's quite possible to deny them, which
Mm-hmm.
isn't a rebuttal to the claim being made by the Declaration. When they say these truths are self-evident, they don't mean they are obvious to everyone. I think what they actually mean is that all of these statements will be agreed upon by someone who truly knows what we're talking about. And the thing we're talking about is man, right? What a human being is, in the way that we understand what a human being is. These are some self-evident truths about that kind of creature in
Mm-hmm.
relation to God, in relation to one another, thus in relation to government, thus this consequence about the right to revolution that follows closely thereafter. And so the first, to answer your question, the first thing presupposed by the Declaration of Independence is that there is a specific people, a particular people with their own culture, their own heritage, their own presuppositions, who are authoring this, or on whose behalf Jefferson, with Adams's edits and so on, are authoring this document.
Mm-hmm.
Our temptation, again, for a variety of reasons, and this is really it seems like a function of our culture to fly to abstraction, fly to excessive abstraction in all kinds of realms. And we do this with the Declaration as well. Our temptation is just to skip that opening, not pay too much attention to the phrasing I've just called attention to, and say, okay, there are certain truths. They have to be taken as the first premises, and then let's go from there.
Mm-hmm.
And there is that kind of syllogism of the Declaration of that first and general premise about what man is, and therefore about government, and then secondly that the British have violated this, and then the conclusion being that we are a separate nation, and that's a valid way of dissecting the Declaration. But what's behind all of that is the fact that there is a certain kind of people living in North America at this time who have organized themselves politically, who have certain presuppositions about themselves, about humanity, about God, about liberty, about the proper form of government, and who are therefore reacting to this outside stimulus in a characteristic way. You can look through the annals of history and you can find many different reactions to similar stimuli. If a tyrant comes along and starts oppressing the people, not every population group will react in the same way. So I think, not stated so explicitly, but there in those opening sentences, there's an assumption about the historical reality of the time and the cultural reality of the kinds of people who could produce the Declaration.
Yeah, that's good. A few things to sort of emphasize. Right. I think this was, you can find this much more readily in the 18th century, with discussion of natural rights, that even if it's like, even if they hold them to be, as the Declaration says, self-evident and therefore just true, right? They're not saying this is merely customary in sort of a rudimentary way. They are true. We think they're true. There's much more recognition than in other places more explicitly that not everyone does, for sure. Not everyone recognizes these things, and therefore they don't act accordingly. They don't elevate them. They don't hold them up. It takes a certain kind of development culturally at scale over time for these things to become self-evident. It takes work to be able to say that. So I think that's, again, we sort of universalize the recognition of the universals, if you like, in this case with the Declaration. And I don't think, as you're pointing out, the Declaration itself is lending itself to that assumption that these things are universally recognized and therefore universally like actionable. I think it's if the Declaration, if Jefferson wasn't honestly able to say that we do hold these things, as his expression of sort of the common mind is what he claims to be doing. Like, this is just what people think here, and I'm just the messenger. If you didn't have that, you would not have this sort of action, and you would not have this sort of self-conception. But it should be recognized, I think, as unique for sure. With the, what do you make of too? Is I do think this is interesting because it's in a lot of in good histories, it's recognized, but in our sort of common histories and narratives, it's not. That already by this point, it's clear from the Declaration that there is a separate sort of identity and self-conception of the Americans. We'll just go ahead and call them. Apart from, I mean, if you read like George Fisher, who's considered almost like revisionist in certain ways early in the 20th century, like he thinks this has gone on for decades and decades at least, that like functionally the people had just separated. This is why a lot of their early arguments prior to legal and military separation, a lot of their arguments are conceiving of themselves as part of the empire, but definitely a different nation. So they're more similarly situated to something like Ireland than being just part of England. And this had just developed sort of naturally with their encounters, their initial settlements, their encounters with the landscape and different challenges, their economic enterprises, which is probably what got them in the most trouble. But very obviously not thinking of themselves as a separate nation. Their accents, like all these things that are the sort of ethnogenesis had already occurred for them. And it seems to me the Declaration, in some sense at least, is recognizing this, even as they understand a sort of lineage and maybe remaining connectivity that could have been saved. But this, do you see it the same way, that like this is a real thing to them? They're not sort of wish casting, but they really have already kind of become different people.
That sounds right to me. Just a couple of one elaboration and some supporting evidence to what you've just articulated. One elaboration is that it seems like that previous decade from the Stamp Act Congress of 1765, and then the First Continental Congress in 74, and then the second in 75, that at the elite level, that seems to be a really important step where we are organizing politically. We are coming together with common cause, with increasingly seen as common grievances. Although, of course, in those early stages, it's easy for Southerners to say, this is Massachusetts' problem, right? This is Boston's problem, right? Don't make it a wider problem. But the more you have those political elites from different states starting to reproduce at a continent-wide level, the representative houses that they have enjoyed for centuries at the state or at the colony level. At that point, that seems like an important step towards that crystallization of a what we'll call a national identity. That said, what you've just described sounds correct. And by the time you get into at least the 1770s, I really don't know how early to pin this, but I'm open to the argument. There is so Edmund Burke. Let me support this with something that Burke says in March 75. So he gives this great speech called the Speech on Conciliation with the Colonies, and it's right before Lexington and Concord. Right? Lexington and Concord happens like a few weeks after he gives this speech. His advice is not heeded. Even if it had been heeded, it would have been too late. But part of his argument is that he's trying to describe that the British have in the American colonies a people who are very sensitive to violations on their liberty. They have a fierce spirit of liberty, he says, and Burke lays out the reasons why they are the way they are. All this ordered towards advising Britain to treat them a certain way, to treat them according to their character, so that we can keep them in the empire. And he lists a number of factors, and one of them is the fact that they are descendants of Englishmen. He says you take the most fanatically attached to liberty segment of the English population and then transport them to America in the 1770s, or excuse me, in the 17th century, in the 1620s and following, what do you expect? You get this kind of people. And he goes on, and he also talks about, among other causes, the geographical distance between America and Britain, the fact that it takes months to go back and forth across thousands of miles of ocean. There's an inevitability that there will be some kind of autonomy there. And so that separate formation of a national consciousness, in a way, seems inevitable for those brute physical or geographic factors, as well as the fact that the people who are going here have a certain kind of enterprising character. And so by the time you get to the crisis of the 1770s, it seems like the best that could come of this is the recognition that, as the founders argue, Parliament does not have the right to legislate for Massachusetts and Virginia. Massachusetts and Virginia already have their own legislative bodies, their own versions of Parliament, which are the General Court of Massachusetts, the House of Burgesses, and then sort of list off the equivalents up and down the Atlantic. And that they begin to understand themselves by the 1770s as Englishmen who have done the English thing, which is organized bodies for self-government, manifesting their natural right, as some would put it, their natural right to legislate for themselves in a way that they see fit, which are these Republican organs in their legislatures and governors and so on. And they all swear they're still loyal to the king. And so, as you mentioned, the opportunity that may have been missed there was to come to some kind of settlement, which would require restraining the Parliament of Great Britain from acting like the legislative body over the colonies, to recognize that the colonies have their own native legislative bodies, and to work out some kind of clear lines of authority, so that you could still have the British or the king, who is in England, be dictating, the foreign policy or something like that of the whole empire, but reserve to the American people the right to govern themselves domestically. And it was Parliament's overstepping of those bounds, much more so than the American people being anti-monarchical. That was the cause of the American Revolution.
Yeah, sounds almost like maybe what federalism was supposed to be could have been the solution. But in any case, that's completely right. I mean, you see, like Samuel Adams says this a lot. He recognizes maybe we as the colonist actually, they could be being self-indulgent here, but he's like, maybe we were actually too patient. We allowed Parliament to do a lot of things we didn't want them to do and we didn't think they should do, but we just kind of let it go, thinking that it would stop, or that it'd be okay. But if we'd objected much earlier, we might not have had such a crisis to this overstep into legislative competence domestically, right, for domestic affairs. And now we're at the point where they kind of have this precedent of several decades, in many cases, on various policies to say, we've already been doing this. Like, what's the issue? And so that, in any case, I think that's that being a sort of definitive mark, at least for Englishmen, that you are an Englishman and in some sense a distinct people at the same time, of legislating for yourselves is just a repeated, and that does get us to the grievances, right? The laws that you pass for themselves, they're not approving them, and this is this is a total violation. How are you supposed to function? So that does seem to be, such a big deal to them. It had been for them in the Glorious Revolution, was sort of the last time that their legislatures had been closed and they weren't allowed to elect their governors and all these sorts of things. So this is a repeat, of that problem. And I think, like, John Adams still lives in that world. He still thinks in terms of 1688 when he talks about what's happening in the No Anglis letters. But in any case, okay, the next thing I wanted to progress to also is in the in the second sentence after we've gotten to the unalienable rights, and you can go back to and contextualize those as well. But something I wanted to throw out too is just this is something I think we sort of glaze over and don't take into account is at least at this stage, it's prior to any new form of government. in the sense that we think of it constitutionally. The way it talks about government is a completely ends-based assessment, right? Rather than the form or the procedure, these things as validating a government. What makes a government legitimate is what it does, what it produces, right? So it says, whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it's just gotten done talking about the rights and talking about the people, then it's the right of the people to, divest themselves and create a new one that is conducive to those ends. And so I think this is something in the Declaration that's not pulled out enough, is like how it doesn't give you a form of government, and that comes later. It doesn't give you particulars, but it does tell you how to think about what a government's supposed to do. And it's supposed to be like results based. That's how you know if it's good or bad. That's how they're assessing the British government at the time. Has it, they don't have a problem with the form in abstract, but they have a problem with what it's doing, right? And so this is the justification. Not that a procedure has been violated as such, but that the violations have produced intolerable sort of results and ends. And I think this should reform the way Americans think about even our own assessment of our government at present, and what we sort of freak out about and then don't freak out about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I largely agree with you. I think I'm going to quibble with you in a way that will bring me around to a very substantial agreement with you.
Yes, perfect.
So in the sentence under discussion, to secure these rights, the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Mm-hmm. That sounds like some kind of process. That government possesses a suite of rights, a suite of powers. Mm-hmm. Some set of those powers are just powers, and you can recognize those just powers by seeing whether they've been derived from the consent of the governed. That's what I take that sentence to mean on its face. Now, it doesn't get into the mechanism of what it means for the people to grant their consent. Mm-hmm. It doesn't say there you have to go through this process, but there is an assertion that because that government power is legitimated primarily. I don't know if it's exclusively, but and maybe that's where the nuance is, but primarily legitimated by the consent of the governed. So that if your people came together and formed a constitution at some time and granted certain powers to the government, and then decades or centuries later, those who happen to be exercising the levers of power had invented, let's just call it a fourth branch of government that is now exercising great power over you, and you, the people, historically have never granted that. Maybe that's a sign. That should be a red flag that this is an unjust power. Mm-hmm. So that's my quibble. There seems to be some kind of deference given to consent of the governed as a legitimating principle. But it does go on, right? Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Mm-hmm. Two things about that. First, the substantial end is pointed out there, as you were emphasizing, their safety and happiness, which seems to encompass the security of all of the rights, the natural rights, and some kind of direction towards or enabling of that for which the rights are worthwhile, happiness, actually enjoying happiness. And so that end of government is emphasized there. The other thing to notice about the sentence is how open-ended it is. The people have the right to lay their new government's foundations on such principles and organize the new government's powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to get the result, to affect their safety and happiness. Mm-hmm. That to me sounds like, although it's dogmatic about the people as the origin of the new form of government, the origin of the principles and the origin of the organization of powers, like which offices exercising which power for how long, et cetera. It seems the end is it's dogmatic about the origin and the end. It's somehow coming from the people, should be for their safety and happiness. The means itself, the structure of government, even the principles that government is founded on. Is it going to be founded on natural equality or not? I actually think the language of the Declaration leaves that wide open. Yeah. And so that is a roundabout way of agreeing with your main point, which is that government ought to, good government is a government that secures certain goods for the people.
Mhm.
Good government is not the checklist of democratic legitimacy or, divine right of kings or whatever you want to
Mhm.
look at. Good government is the government that acts like a true shepherd towards the flock.
Mhm.
And you know it when you see it, and you know it when that's not what you have.
Mhm.
The national interest is being secured or being undermined.
Yeah. No, I think I agree with all of that. I mean, there's obviously development in the understanding of an articulation of like what consent to the governed entails as a um, at least conduit of, we would say, government authority, right? So we still maintain it all comes from God, but like, how do you choose the rulers? From whence does it arrive inside of time? I mean, I think that even certainly late medieval theorists maintained the same thing. It's some in some way, it has to be that it's there's at least tacit consent by the people, by continued sort of acquiescence to a form and a certain process of getting rulers. Maybe it's the ephors electing them. Maybe it is hereditary, but they're like fine with it. And ultimately, its legitimacy comes from its representation of the people, right? Something has to get it up there. That's like the whole point of it. So I think, as a general principle, I think there's good and bad ways to like take it, but it's a basically unassailable principle that in some way, and maybe it is very particularized. Like you have to. I think you could even say it this way: part of the legitimacy of the government is that the people kind of believe this is the case, that this is kind of what's going on. We've decided we like it this way, more or less, and they're representing us and they're doing things for us. That's like the whole point of the gig. And you could, based on your proclivities and customs and history, decide, what mechanisms or process communicate that to you. That we're like, this is the stamp of approval. But I think that basic point in the Declaration is totally undebatable in the most basic form, at least. And I think in terms of, maybe one development by the 18th century is like that you have a lot of debate over up through the 18th century, 17th century as well, as like what exactly the popular sovereignty entails. And I think the big one that's always that always trips me up as a problem is, I think there's no objection again on the front end to saying, well, we're going to elect you. Like election is a totally legitimate way to get governors, and we just choose them. We like you. We're going to take you. It's whether and when that authority can be rescinded sort of at will that I think is where all the action is, and things can get problematic. And I think that's part of why this has to be stated in the Declaration the way it does. It's like, how do you legitimate what you're doing? So you at least have to have one well-established theory, which is in this sense, there is an accountability built into popular sovereignty, not just as the origin, but as sort of job performance. And I think that can be affirmed in different ways. Here, maybe in the Declaration, it's somewhat more aspirational. I think when Burke's talking about, insofar as he's talking about this in his speech, it's kind of like, this is what happens. People just do it. You don't have to theorize it. This is just going to happen. As he has that line of like, once people get convinced of this, like there's no stopping it. Once they decide there are different people, or once they decide their liberties have been intolerably encroached, you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. And like, you can have the best theory in the world that they're overstepping their bounds, but it's just as the way things go. So I think on either case, it's defensible. There's good arguments for it. But I think that's, to me, with popular sovereignty, that's like where it always gets sticky. It's not sort of the beginning. It's like the end, I guess, the end of a government. Like, when do you decide you can do this? And obviously, even the founders were sensitive to sort of the shifting sentiments of the people that might be against actually their best interest in some way. Like, if you're going to actually, at some point, you actually govern, and you have to be able, as Burke also says in his speech on representation, you don't capitulate to the demands of the children. At some point, you're like, no, this is not the way it's going to go. It's not good for you. But at this stage, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, yeah, just the line from Burke's speech on conciliation is he's talking about this fierce spirit of liberty and the six sources, frankly, the ethnic background, right? The descent from Englishmen, the form of government of being used to representative bodies. the role of religion, he says religion in the North and manners, which are closely tied to the institution of slavery in the South. So the very strong sort of, he calls it the Protestantism of Protestantism, the dissidents of dissent in those who settle Massachusetts and their sort of their concern for governing themselves at a congregational level as well as politically, and then the effect of even slavery in the South. He says, very interestingly, he says in slave societies, those who are free are even more jealous of their freedom because they see the contrast between freedom and slavery so starkly. Of education, he says, Americans are all smatterers in the law. So you're the lawyer. I guess I'm the smatterer in the law.
I do love that line
in this conversation. But the result of that is that this study, that the fact that Americans are all studying the law to some lesser or greater extent, renders men acute, inquisitive, dexterous, prompt in attack, ready in defense, full of resources. And he says that they judge of an ill principle of government not only by an actual grievance. Here they anticipate the evil. Judge of the they don't wait for the actual grievance. Instead, they anticipate the evil. Judge of the pressure of the grievance by the badness of the principle. They augur misgovernment at a distance and snuff the approach of tyranny in every tainted breeze. So they're suspicious when it comes to tyrannical power. And then finally, the 3,000 miles of ocean that separate. All of these contribute to the fierce spirit of liberty. And then Burke concludes by saying, the question is not whether their spirit deserves praise or blame, but what in the name of God shall we do with it? This is Burke being extremely realistic. And I'd like to make a broader point here that might guide us in how we think about the Declaration of Independence. Burke's point is you need to understand the kind of people you are governing if you're going to govern them well. It's insufficient to discover the abstract theory of what good government is or of what people in general want or will respond to. You can imagine sort of philosophical and sort of social scientific versions of attempting to do this. That's insufficient. Maybe that's going to be helpful in some way, but you're going to need to actually know who these people are. To draw out the analogy with children that you brought up, it's not enough to sort of know in the abstract how to raise children. You have to get to know your own children and see that for one child, one thing will work, and for another child, the opposite thing will work because of their temperament, because of their character, their condition, and so on. And the same goes for government, that if you're going to be a good governor, you need to know who these people are. And the general way of thinking about this is that peoples are different, and they are different in part due to the principles that they articulate for themselves and the goals that they pursue. But they're also different for quite mundane reasons, like their history and their socioeconomic condition. The philosophic way of putting this, and I'm going to go back to Aristotle for help here. Aristotle talks about every substance, everything in the world, every object, natural and even artificial, as being a unity of matter and form. My glass, my cup is made of glass as its material, but it's formed into the shape of a cup, and that dictates its purpose. It can achieve its final end of retaining a drink and then in a sort of way that's convenient for me to drink out of because of its matter and because of its shape, its form. And so the matter and the form and the purpose for which the cup exists are all tied together. And the technical term for this is that they're all a hylomorphic unity. Hylomorphic just means matter or form matter union of material and shape or form. I think the same is the case of political communities. Aristotle applies this to objects, to animals and plants and people. I think he would apply it to political communities as well, that their material matters as well as their form. And so what's their material? Surely it would include like the geography, the land of this nation or city that you're concerned with. But it would above all include the people. You're going to be able to achieve a better form of government with people who already have good habits, who already have the habit of being ruled under law, who already have a certain level of virtue, than you are with a criminal population or with a backwards population. And so the material substrate, you could say, the material matters for the final achievement of the nation that you are crafting or you are guiding. And so the form, maybe that's the regime or the form of government, which is more clearly connected to the end, right? It's easier to see what the purpose of the Soviet Union was by looking at the Soviet regime than by like looking at like Russian people generally, although maybe there's some connection there. But you can see how the form of government of the American Republic or of the Soviet Union or any other number of nations is closely tied together with the purpose for which this regime, this form of government exists. All of which is to say, when we approach the study of any political community, including our own, we can't be oblivious to the population. These things matter. And the founders understood, took for granted, then said explicitly in various times and places that the population itself matters. Conservatives love to repeat the line from John Adams writing to the Massachusetts militia that our Constitution is made only for moral and religious people. Okay, he's positing something there about the quality of people you need in order to enjoy this Constitution that was just crafted. Benjamin Franklin, again, famously says, what kind of government do we have? A republic if you can keep it. And then he elaborates, and then I don't know if that's actually a true saying, but everyone reports that anecdote. And then he actually says in closing the Constitutional Convention that this is this Constitution is the result of compromise, and I didn't get everything I wanted, but neither did anyone else. And then he adds an interesting comment, which is that this is going to be a good government for our people unless and until they become the kind of people who can only be governed despotically. That's a striking statement, that there are some peoples, if you degrade your character to a certain level, if you lose the habit of personal virtue and of self-government, maybe the best you could be capable of is like being ruled over by an enlightened despot. To recognize that is in no way to hope for that, but it's to be as realistic as the founders were, as realistic as our long philosophic tradition was, which is that the best government for this people is going to be different than the best government able to be achieved for this other nation.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's shocking to people, but it's because even when you cite these things to them from the founders, they reject them still. I'm like, well, okay, but that's what they thought. This is how they are sensible and good statesmen. They're not idealist in this sense, that they understand what they've got. And I think probably maybe if people understand it this way enough, like what is shocking about it, that reality is that even if you affirm a sort of basic natural equality, which I think is totally legitimate, we can use the state of nature hypothetical or whatever, there's in nature, there's no, given reason by nature, one rules over the other in authority, right? Because this type of authority to rule over other men is something very different, and then that leads you to talk of the consent of the governed and so on. But it is the recognition that there's not political equality inside one political regime or across regimes and nations and peoples. Not everything is the same, and men who are like living according to their highest dignity and created potential, being what they're supposed to be, which is virtuous and just and honoring and all these things, can be ruled a certain way in accordance with their nature. And those types of people should be ruled by law because they're intellectuals. They're intellectual creatures, they're reasonable creatures, and therefore the best way to communicate them, the same way God communicates and rules over us, ideally, is through law. That's how he with Adam and Eve in the garden, prior to sin, he's going to rule them through law, right? Because this is how we have been made to be able to do it. But if you reduce yourself to bestial sort of behavior and way of life, there's only one way to sort of rule beasts, and that's through despotism. They don't respond to the same mechanisms of rule that others do. And I think that's the warning always, is like if you degrade yourselves to the point of where you're acting like animals, you're not acting like men, there's a certain way that you'll have to be ruled. And you can see this throughout the world even today. It's like, do I like Assad like as a person, or would I like to live under that kind of, I guess he's gone now, but that kind of rule? Definitely not. But you have to ask the question, like, how do you rule that type of place and have any semblance of order whatsoever?
Mm-hmm.
That's a tough question. It's not one we'd like the answer to, but I think when things are that chaotic and degraded, that's certain types of rule are called for. And the founders like recognize this, not as you're saying, not as an aspiration or a goal, but as a warning of like, if you like this, if you like being ruled by, ordinances of a reason for the common good that are promulgated and you're given notice on, and by the one who has legitimate authority. If you like that, and you like a certain kind of liberality, even with one another, you have to be the type of people that can handle that, because what's definitely clear is you have to have governance.
Yeah.
It's just a question of what type. And just like with parents, I mean, you know this, that the analogies between parenthood and governance, like throughout, especially early modern theory, are like everywhere. And so then it's really fun to read like 17th century parenting books alongside like political thought. They're like the same.
Okay.
And they do all the same lessons. And they're like,
Yeah.
know what type of kid you have. Like, don't be overbearing. You should, beating them as a last result, all these sorts of things. And it's like the same advice if you read like the Mirrors for Princes literature. It's like, okay,
don't be overbearing, beat them as a last result.
Beat them as a last result. They might rebel more, pray for them, be a good example, all these great things. But then at the end of the day, it's like, you have to maintain authority though. You can't let them live like little savages in your household. You're trying to raise men, and in there's a certain element of paternalism that's like inescapable in governance. It obviously changes because you're dealing with adults, and you can have a constitutional government like Aristotle talks about between men and women, even because they're you're equals in a certain sense. But there's an element of that that's like inescapable, and it's like back to all you're saying is the same thing that like every kid hates to hear, is like, I'll treat you like an adult if you'll act like one. That's like, no one wants to hear that, but that's kind of like what you get to, even on biblical grounds. It's like, Bible doesn't give us the form of government, the style, any of these things. But it says you have to have it. And then it has great passages in the Old Testament of what it looks like when you don't have anything. And it's awful. It's worse for everybody. So all that is a roundabout way of saying, I think to get us back to like another thing that undergirds all this is perhaps more emphasized. I think James Hankins is great on this aspect for the sort of Renaissance theory, but it's like, the main thing, the reason they harp on it so much, on the virtue and the character of people and the virtue and character of rulers, is there's like no substitute for it. You can have the greatest system in the world, and it just doesn't matter if you don't have virtuous and just people and rulers.
That's right. And you slipped St. Thomas's definition of law into there. So I'm going to take that as an opening to say something about Aquinas a little bit more.
Absolutely.
This is a great example of how Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas and basically everyone who lived before 1800 or so was way far more rational in their approach to politics than we are today.
Yeah.
Where in the sense that they have correct ideas about what the purpose of government should be, and they are realistic. Instead of forcing every nation and every person into a one size fits all ideal. That's how you get some of the greatest horrors of 20th century totalitarianism is positing this abstraction and then trying to will it into being and breaking as many eggs as necessary to get there. But in St. Thomas, in the treatise on law, he distinguishes, right, the eternal law and then the natural law, which is rational creatures' participation in the eternal law, right? Eternal law is sort of like the mind of God or the reason of God governing the whole universe. And so then the natural law is available to all of us, and we're familiar with this probably more immediately from its moral implications, that there are certain duties that we must fulfill, and there are certain like red lines of intrinsically evil acts, and that's dictated by the natural law and not just by convention. But for Thomas, the natural law is also in a sense, the basis for, or the principle for human law. And when he talks about human law, he talks about it as being necessary, that we do need particular governors, particular governments for particular nations or human communities. And he spells out how the natural law is necessary but not sufficient for governing a political community because it's too general. It's not that it's wrong or deficient, but it is not sufficient in that it does not, the natural law on its own does not spell out not only all of the possible derivations and consequences of it if you just are reasoning correctly, but the choices that sometimes have to be made. Most mundanely, now that we have cars, we have to decide which side of the road to drive on if we're going to protect life and limb and property more reliably than not having traffic laws. And it really does not matter whether it's right or left until you choose, and then it does matter. Right. And that, and then also, the particular punishment for particular crimes, all kinds of things fall within the ambit of the legislator, of the human lawgiver. And we need to, I think in Thomas's framework, we need to cooperate with God in being providential over ourselves and those under our care. And this is quite a high calling to engage correctly in human legislation, in the legislation for human communities, which takes its bearings from the natural law and, of course, from the divine law, which contains a kind of authoritative statement of the natural law in parts, also points towards the perfection of the natural law in grace. All of that is I think Thomas would say, indispensable for the human lawgiver. But there's, I think, analogously to how the human individual moral agent, there's a real dignity in responding to the call of moral action that God leaves to us, and the liberty that he leaves to us in actually living out in a virtuous manner our lives that he's given us. There's also a great dignity in cooperating with God in bringing the rudiments of legislation to fruition and to completion in our political community. And for the individual moral agent, it's going to depend on who you are and what you're doing and what your context is, right? What the morally correct action is going to depend on the agent and the context and the circumstances, and all of those factors. And in the case of human law, what the best law code to institute is going to depend upon the context and the people and their population, their habits, and their history, and all of those different things. And so we have to have all of which to say the classical and medieval tradition is much more, I think, grounded and realistic. You might even want to say flexible, though that could give the wrong impression, but appropriately, prudently flexible than modern ideologies of asserting that the only good government is democratic government defined in this way. No, that might be an okay government for some people, but there are other governments that are better for other peoples, and they ought to all be aiming at the achievement of the common good.
Yeah. I think that, is a typical thing you'll find in like earlier texts is they're very comfortable saying, here's the three, especially theologians do this, right? Because they don't want to give like direct prescriptives, and they especially don't want to say something in their own context that would get them in trouble. So they don't, but they're very comfortable saying, here's the three basic forms of government, or maybe there's five, or, whatever. Then there's, of course, the degenerated forms. And which one's best? Whichever one's governs best. That's the best one, and then they just like move on. And then they're like, here's the character you want in a ruler. Here's the character you want in people. This is the important stuff to get. And then you can make your selection prudentially later, as well as as I thought it was a great recitation of the relationship between the forms of law. And it's even right to say that it's a dictate of natural law that you make human law. Right. It's actually, you're actually violating the natural law if you say we're just not going to perform this function. The natural law precludes anarchy or even solitary existence. I think Aquinas says somewhere that like the hermit is a result of the fall. It's a degenerated person because you're not supposed to live alone. You're supposed to be a social creature, and he's not living under human governance, which is what you're supposed to do. So these things are like non-negotiable. You have to have them. There's no real alternatives. So then the only question is which one's good for you, and which one produces, even if you have a strong sort of conception of individual rights, which one's going to protect those? And I think the really tough question that we've already alluded to and are doing so again now is not only is a government not fit for every people, a particular type, but it's not fit even for every people at every time. I mean, that's part of what the Declaration is getting at, or is implicitly saying by their own timeline, that it's not doing what it's supposed to do anymore for us, right? Which is a really hard, uncomfortable question for us in America today. Is like, okay, if we establish the ends of government as the founders also identified them, then what do we do if and how do what do we do if we recognize that those things are not being produced anymore? It's not protecting the people. I mean, this is a big one for what's his name in South Carolina? I can't remember. He gives a great speech in '76 to the South Carolina legislature. It's not Tudor, but it's someone else, where he just says the final straw was when the king proved he could no longer protect us. It's like, this is the bare minimum of government, is to protect you. And so what do you do when you find your government can't protect you, or it's not doing any of the sort of constitutional obligations that are implicit even in like a coronation? We'd say it's our oath of office, where you're signing up and we're signing up, right? And like, we're sort of agreeing to these stipulations. Maybe they're arbitrary according to nature, but we've chosen them. That's like when it's really hard. And I think doesn't require you to have rebellion, but it does require you to be non-ideological about your form of government, which conservatives seem to struggle to do.
Right. And again, this all might seem quite distant from the Declaration, and maybe some of it is, but
maybe it is.
Point. Yeah. I'm not trying to say like assert without argument that the Declaration of Independence is like a thoroughly Thomistic document. Like, I think there's a certain agreement and certain disagreement there.
Yes, for sure.
But they certainly, in contrast to contemporary right think, they belong more to each other's world than to ours.
Indeed.
But just to point to some points of contact, the Declaration is cognizant of the difference between kinds of peoples. And it doesn't make it a theme, but I think it's the kind of thing that is obvious to the men of the time. And so it surfaces indirectly. So, for example, in the grievances, when the colonists blame the king for transporting mercenaries to our shores, they say that this is totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. Okay, they've posited a category there of the thing that is morally, that is worthy of a civilized nation's ruler. Okay, there must be uncivilized nations then as well, and in fact, very soon thereafter, in the most politically incorrect grievance, which is right at the end, the king has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Okay, there are civilized nations and there are savages, and they behave in a different manner. Certainly in war, presumably in how they govern themselves in peace as well. There are these different categories, and when the king is indicted for not acting in the way in which king over a civilized people, they also use the language of a free people at certain times in the Declaration. These are politically relevant categories. These are constitutionally relevant categories. And so, I think the pre-modern tradition of Aristotle and St. Thomas, the founders are aware of these differences in kind, that America and Afghanistan are quite different because of their population, their history, their religion, their moral codes, surely like their geography, their socioeconomic basis. All of these things are going to matter to some degree for what their political achievement can be. And so when we look back at the Declaration, which is one of the great achievements of the founding period, and we think about how we can adhere to it, or whether we ought to, in what ways, and so on, we have to recognize that presupposition of its authors, that yes, these are self-evident truths, but they're self-evident to us, and they're obviously not evident to other people or to all peoples. And yes, this is the government that we deem best. Maybe it is in fact best, the simply best government. But even if that's the case, then we are quite a privileged people if we're able to achieve the best government simply. Right? That's Montesquieu, who says that the best government is the one that is best suited to the people in question. Right? The best laws are the ones that are best suited to this people. And so that kind of realism and groundedness in cultural differences as being relevant to what a polity can achieve is I think taken for granted by the founders. All of what we're saying, right, is more or less direct criticism of propositional nationhood, right? That term today, that in order to be a member of this kind of nation, all you have to do is read and assent to certain propositions.
Yeah.
That notion of nationhood sort of fails, I think, by its own standard there to apply to today, because our population in no way does a majority of our population, I think, maybe I don't know, a large swath of our population no longer even assents to the propositions of the Declaration.
Yeah.
And so there is a crisis that you're alluding to, that we need to be able to think around and through the Declaration, and see the alternatives. Because even if we abstract from cultural conditions, the fact that so many people of different backgrounds and ages are no longer have reverence for or intellectual assent to, much less real lived assent to this kind of document, means that we can't just hold up a document of propositions and expect the corresponding form of government to fall into place. We don't even have that. Even if that's all that it took, we don't even have that as a critical mass of our population.
Yeah. It's not like you assent to the I believe in the post office or something, and now I'm an American. And it's no doubt, and we were kind of talking about this before we recorded, that there can be on the right, especially, critiques, legitimate frustrations with what you're outlining there, can lead to an overcorrection in a way, because I do think it's true that every people, every nation has certain propositions they uphold, because it's basically saying, what's the ideal citizen? Like, who do we want to form? Who do we want to reproduce? What are they like? What do they pursue? Especially on our behalf, right? Like in contra, how do they contribute to perpetuating us? And so I think propositions like are, always around. They're like inescapable. The problem that we're identifying is like the detachment between the two things, right? And that these actually go as a pair everywhere together. And so thinking you can export them readily, or that they don't require a certain kind of attending to maintain a kind of aspirational allegiance that you want your people to have. Like, this is what we're always after. Even if you fail, this is where, what we hold out as being the successful. It requires, this kind of, it goes back to the Adams quote. I mean, it requires a certain kind of preconditions and management to keep producing the type of people that do aspire to those things in the way you want. So I think, that's really what is the problem, is the detachment between the more realist assessment of political life from these ideals that certain types of people can aspire to and even achieve, if they're great and virtuous people. And I think our founding generation, for some time thereafter, were like genuinely incredible people. So they were able to aspire to great things and hold those up. But we're missing like all the key ingredients to have that. And I think once going off Montesquieu, it's like, if you're a good statesman anywhere, you have to assess, like, what do we have? What's the raw material here? What kind of people do we have? And that's going to dictate how you can govern it unto the proper ends. And so just like incessant appeal to kind of procedure and forms without that assessment is actually doing, the founders, I think, would say, you're not being a good statesman. You're doing your people a disservice. You have to be like totally clear-eyed and realistic about what you have, and therefore what you can achieve. And sort of endless appeal to abstractions is not going to fix it. But that requires a certain kind of, as we were talking about earlier, paternal attitude of like, what do we got to do to form these people into virtuous people? How do you lead them there? I mean, this is of course Aquinas and his advice to the king of Cyprus, right? It's like, this is what you do. Even if you have sin, this is what you're doing. You're like directing these people. You're helping them choose between common goods and other things that could be equally good, but you got to make a choice, and so how do you actually do have to lead, you have to govern. And this is like something we're somewhat allergic to now, even as it's becoming more and more necessary.
Yeah. And maybe analogous to what you're describing as the governor's role in governing and leading. There's a bigger picture analogy there of assimilation to the culture that has enabled this kind of political achievement is going to be necessary. There has to be a kind of cultural leadership. If you want that form of government that was produced and achieved and taken for granted by that initial dominant culture to be preserved. And so just to get quite specific, right, if you look at the history, if you look at their self-understanding, and then also just do some comparative work, it's pretty undeniable that the American founding was an Anglo-Protestant culture, the achievement of an Anglo-Protestant culture. I say that, look, I'm Greek Catholic, right? So I'm not just trying to stroke my own ego. Like, yes, okay, I have like a Scottish forebear who was here like right before the Revolution. But his family, my descent there was assimilated into this dominant culture, and my later ancestors who came from Greece, right, were still to some extent assimilated into what remained of that culture in the 20th century. If you do, just as a matter of description, if you do not have assimilation to the dominant culture, which produced and enabled the regime form, and then you have massive levels of immigration for decades or centuries, then you just expect the form of government to change. And even if the forms remain there, even if the same terms are used, even if the Constitution is still on the books technically, you should expect the substance of the government to change. There's going to be a substantial change because you've swapped out a significant part of the matter, and you haven't, in terms of the population, and you haven't integrated that new material, the new population, into the old form, and thus the old end. And this isn't simply a problem of assimilation of immigrants, right? This is also a product of every time a new human being is born, they have to be educated. So how are you going to educate them? Are you going to catechize them in the old time religion or into something new? Are you going to raise them into the beliefs of your political culture or into new ones? And so you have this shift occurring through the progressive era among, frankly, the Anglo-Protestant elite of the 20th century. And you have shifts coming just from massive immigration that is less and less well integrated as you get to the end of the 20th century. And so it would be surprising if there were not a substantial change in what the government was, given all of those factors. And I think the founders would have been the first people to recognize that this is what you should expect if you no longer understand the rationale for the original form of government, which is in some way is contained in the Declaration, and if you no longer have the same cultural background in the population, and if you start to disavow the project of integrating and assimilating new populations into that dominant culture, then of course it will be a different form of government. And that's a partial explanation of the troubles that we face today.
Yeah, no, I think it's exactly right. And it's always, it seems to me it's very hard. You can support assimilation through legislation, but it's very hard to like manage it exactly. It requires like a stable and kind of confident culture they're coming into at a manageable rate. I just don't see how like you could actually guarantee good assimilation through legislation. It has to be the people doing the work with their own kind of assertiveness, but then at a manageable pace. You can't do this with sort of mass numbers. It's just too fast and it's too much, and it allows people to form micronations or ghettoize sort of in the country where they're not faced with because assimilation is very hard, right? Going to new cultures and trying to fit in is very hard. So you will naturally, like I grew up as a missionary kid. I mean, Americans congregate wherever they are because at some point you just want that. You're exhausted, you want to be. So if you're doing it, and at that point you're missionaries, you're technically just long-term visitors for a particular reason. But if you have people really moving there, you have to create conditions that force them to do that essentially over time, and then it's successful. But it's like an English test is not going to fix it. I think we should have that, but it really is something much more fluid and sort of organic. And when you've just, if you're, as you're pointing out, if your own culture, native culture, you might say, is sort of giving up the ghost, that's just not going to happen. And I think that absolutely did happen for various reasons. You can get this from like Jean Baudin's, 6 books on the Commonwealth. talks about the category of like essentially a native born foreigner, which is someone who doesn't love the things of the nation. He hates them.
Yeah.
So he's from here. He should love, but he's actually like an internal foreigner. And he has all sorts of advice what you're supposed to do, those kind of people. But it's like we have an increasing population of what I would say are native born foreigners. They're people that actually make their living and entertain themselves hating everything about their own people. And if you have a critical mass of those combined with a critical mass of newcomers that are unassimilated, that's just disastrous. You can't manage that.
I imagine this is a novel category of our own time, which is the foreign-born America explainer, right?
Yes, yeah, right, exactly.
I don't know if like France in the 17th century had that problem. Like this seems like a peculiarly postmodern American problem.
Yes,
of someone who has himself an immigrant or just very shallow generational roots in America. Who is very comfortable saying, the essence of America is this new thing.
Yes.
And in their defense, very often the thing that they posit is like the worst ideas of a previous generation's native born foreigners, right?
Yes, exactly.
It's like the old wasps who went so far left in progressivism and undermined their own nation that they ought to have been referencing and passing on to the children that they're not having anymore.
Yes.
And then you have someone relatively fresh off the boat saying, this is what we mean by America. And it bears almost no resemblance to the America of the founders.
Yeah. This was like this was in a way the freak out over like the Vivek Ramaswamy stuff like months ago was like, that's kind of what he does. Right. And he was saying these kind of had these sort of very libertarian talking points, as you said, very surface level kind of idealistic stuff. And a lot of people were just like, what are you doing lecturing me about this? And he was, I think most damningly for him was when he started talking badly about Americans.
Yeah.
That's when you're like, okay, you don't get to do that for sure. So you have, but he's not making that stuff up on his own, as you said. He's getting it from other places, probably the native born foreigners that are feeding these sorts of really flimsy ideals that work well for fundraisers and stuff, but it's not good education. And it certainly is not going to instill in anybody the type of love and adoration for your country and your history that's necessary to maintain a good citizenry. So it's not a good recipe whatsoever.
And what is the more American timing for this kind of dispute than Christmas, right? Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, right?
That's right.
Okay, I understand actually if you go far enough back in American history, like the Puritans in New England aren't that big on Christmas,
right?
But it's become, I think, a pretty mainstream part of American identity that Christmas is a holiday.
Yes.
And so why do we have Elon Musk, who's actually a foreigner,
yes,
and then Vivek Ramaswamy, who's of recent immigrant parentage, trying to dunk on Americans and trying to push the H-1B expansion on Christmas Day and in the octave of Christmas of all seasons.
It's perfect. When did Washington go to go after the Hessians?
There you go. Okay,
it's absolutely what we do. The foreigners, perfect. The foreign mercenaries. It's who you need to go after around the holiday time. In any case. Okay. I mean, I think this is covered. We've been kind of all over the place, but I think we covered good ground and various topics about some of the necessary background understanding to even approach the Declaration. I don't know if we got through all we already started touching on the grievances, so we got through most of the opening lines and these sorts of things, and maybe hopefully it's a general guide, providing a general sort of tenor and approach to understanding these things well. And I think also applies to and is evident from our other, what we consider in the sort of founding canon of documents as well. These things are just assumed. And you can't speak about peoples and nations in any coherent sense without talking about this stuff as well. So any sort of parting, though, comments or thoughts that maybe we should have mentioned or touched on, and we can leave them uninterrogated if we need to, but that you'd like to throw out there?
Yeah, just I think we started to touch on this. I think there's a virtuous mean between propositional nationhood and strictly ethnic analysis of America. And I think that what we were describing and what I invoked Aristotle to try to describe is that virtuous mean, that you actually can't neglect either part of the equation, and reducing what America or any nation is simply to its ideas, or simply to the blood that runs in the veins of its dominant population or its original population. Both of those are going to do injustice, because, and I think this is ultimately because of what a human being is, that that we are embodied and ensouled. We're a unity of body and soul. We have histories, we have bloodlines, right? We have ancestors, but we also have ideas and thoughts, and we have free will. And so, if you only emphasize, what we create or what we think up, you're going to neglect the inheritance that we have that's always somehow informing those creative or intellectual projects. And conversely, if you only emphasize who you are on a sort of biological or ethnic or whatever level, you're going to miss the fullness of the human being as well. I think that applies to individuals, and I think it also applies at the political level, that the debate between propositional nationhood and the most, I think, excessive reaction to it, of just saying that the only thing that matters for American identity is your heritage. Both of those are partially true answers, and I think that framework of Aristotle seeing every substance as a unity of matter and form helps explain why they're both partial.
Yeah, I think it. As I understand it, the language and that idea is still maintained, in things that Pufendorf talks all the time about the compound moral person. And I think this is what he's getting at for the nation. It needs to be thought of as in anthropological terms. So it's got a morality. It has a soul, but it's also still, a person embodied. So it is the hylomorphic understanding of that. And I think it's, in any sort of ancient texts, and medieval and early modern texts, like good political theories always begin with like the nature of man for a reason, because you have to like establish these things, not just for his own need for society, but what the society is, and it represents the person himself. So I think that's exactly right. And I think a lot of, especially for Christians, I find some of the biggest hangups are in confusion of like the two dualisms, the body and soul, and then also nature and grace, and confusion of how those things interact and exist leads to a lot of bad conclusions about political and social life is I think a root of a lot of it. People may not understand it that way, but that's like what's happening often, especially for Christians, I think. So if you don't have this, if it's all, for most Christians, it's all soul, there's no body, these things don't matter for people, or they shouldn't matter, let's pretend they don't. So it's almost like a Gnosticism in a way. And then for the other, it's like grace does just totally abrogate nature. These things don't matter anymore. The grace has come. Therefore, it's wiped away. The nature, which has like, problems for your Christology, if that's the case, I just think, but incarnation is a problem. So yes, I think that's important to, and these things, a proper corrective is to hold these things in tandem and in balance, in the way that you've articulated, not to then overcorrect where we're purely material, because then you are just beasts, right? So we're neither gods nor beasts. We have to be a real people. So I think that's very helpful and a good. And I don't know about Jefferson, but certainly someone like James Wilson still is explicit in this way. His maybe his Thomism is filtered through Richard Hooker, but it's still there. This is definitely how he's still articulating things in his lectures. So it's native to us. No one has to freak out. This is things that happened on our soil, as talked about. You can pick a different source if you don't like Aquinas, but you should like Aquinas. And anyway, Pavlos, thank you so much for talking to me, having this conversation. I hope it's helpful to people as we begin to start thinking about our celebration next year. And people should, maybe if nothing else, go memorize the Declaration, make their kids do it. don't beat them except as a last resort in memorizing it. You should act like a good ruler in your household. But it could be necessary if they're too resistant,
to memorizing the Declaration.
Yeah. Well, I was telling that someone the other day. I was like, my parents were school teachers and like very, I think my brother was raised somewhat different and he's much younger, but they're very like lenient with even my schooling of like kind of just let him, if he wants to do it, he'll do it. I'm like, now I'm going to overcorrect. I'm going back to the 18th century model where you like cane kids while they learn Latin, to make sure for good measure. It's like everyone would write about that. They would just beat you even when you're getting your declensions right. They do it anyway. It's like, anyway.
Well, good luck with that.
Yeah, it's a joke, audience.
Yeah.
It's a joke. Yes, indeed. But this is a very good and fruitful discussion. I think we could talk longer for it, but we will close it up for today. Thank you again for being generous with your time. And thank you, audience, as always, for listening. And do subscribe. And until next time, God bless.
You can find American Reformer on the internet at www.americanreformer.org or on x.com, formerly Twitter, at @AMReformer. Don't forget to like, rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Please consider supporting us today by making a tax-deductible donation through our secure online donation portal at AmericanReformer.org. That's AmericanReformer.org.